Salutations gamers, I'm DeviantArt Game, and welcome back to Art Advice with Mr. Game. Today we're going to be discussing how to do headshots, faces, that sort of thing. Now, there are a few things to keep in mind when doing faces. The main thing to keep in mind is that unlike other parts of the body where muscle will have a larger determining factor in how that part of the body is going to be shaped, the bones of the face are very heavily determining factors in how the facial structure is going to go. Muscle does play some role. We are going to talk about that as well. But for the most part, bone is going to be the big thing. Fat in the face also is important, but let's go over some of the shapes, sort of groupings in the face. So as I talked about in the last episode, construction, grouping the face into certain parts. I'm going to go over parts of the skull to keep in mind. For one, we have the brow region, generally around here. Now, I do want to specify something about the eye sockets. Now, you notice how large the eye sockets are. But if you actually look at a human face, the eyes on a human face are obviously not that large. And the reason for that is because they're covered over in skin. Like the brow, actually the muscles of the brow will come over that area, and the eyelids will also sort of cover this area to some extent. So the eyes themselves will generally, the visible part of the eye anyway, will be a lot thinner. But the eye sockets are something to keep in mind because if you look at your own face, you'll notice there should be sort of a sunken in area between, if I erase this real quick so you can see it a bit better. Oops. You should notice a sunken in area between your cheekbones. If you can feel your face, you should notice sort of the cheekbone area right in and around here. If you feel into your own face, you'll notice this sort of cheekbone area somewhere on your face. It could be higher or lower. Each face is a bit different. You'll notice a cheekbone area. But you'll also notice that your eyes will be somewhat more around up in this area. At least the visible part of your eye will be up around here. But there'll be a lot of skin in this area that'll be sort of more sunken into the face to some degree. So keeping in mind where the eye socket is important for shaping the face, because that part of the face will be somewhat embedded in. Another part to keep in mind, other than just eye sockets and eye position, obviously, is the cheekbones themselves. The cheekbones are a big one I generally try to keep track of. The cheekbones, generally around this area. And cheekbone positions and the strength of a cheekbone is going to, depend on the person. All these different factors that I'm going to be pointing out to you, keep in mind that depending on the person's face, not every skull, not every face looks the same, and the bones, the positions of them are going to be different on different people. Temples, also something to keep in mind. It's sort of an indentation in the head, and some people's, this area in the head for some people is much more well-defined than it is in other people. Some people don't have that sort of area defined. Some people do. Let me just quickly outline. But keep in mind that where the temple is always going to be across from the brow. Because the brow bone actually kind of feeds into the temple area. As you can see right here. I'm just outlining certain areas and erasing them just so you can see. So you should see there, right where I've kind of erased, the brow bone itself goes into the temple, and that's always going to be the case. So keep that in mind, that wherever you're going to put the brow as far as the height of it on the face that you're drawing, the skull, the brow bone is going to feed in to the temple. And that temple is always going to be there. Of course, you have the nose region, which is... Now, the nose is mostly cartilage. Now, when you look at a skull like this, you can see this is kind of hollow. And the reason for that being on like a skull like this is the fact that there is actually a sort of kind of bone-like structure that is supposed to be here that we can't see when a human face is fully, intact. And the reason for that is that this sort of section is made up of cartilage that, breaks down and deteriorates, so you can't see it on a skull. So you kind of get this sort of thing here. But it should kind of... but the cartilage itself would kind of extend from this region down. So you can kind of see on this face here these sort of regions I'm trying to point out to you in the face. These are important groupings of the skull. Keep in mind, as I said, skull groupings are important. Of course, the jaw kind of has multiple segments to it. So you have sort of the back jaw and then sort of a chin area. And this will be a bit different on different people. You can see that there. So these are the separate pieces that kind of make up the skull, and these pieces are important when discussing how you build the face, because you want to some degree, however you're designing the character's face to look like, you want to break up the parts of the face into these sort of groups. Also, this area below the teeth, notice that there is a gap. This is important because depending on the character that you draw, and some characters this will be more defined than others, so this sort of gap in the teeth, in the jaw right here that I'm outlining right now, that spot, if a character has a fatter face, then it's not going to make much difference in that particular region. It's just going to kind of, be fat. But when somebody is like starving or skinny, the skin is going to tighten up around this skull quite a bit. And in particular, it's going to go into this area where there's no bone and create those indentations that I'm sure you've seen before, where you have you get this well-defined cheekbone kind of region here, see? You get this defined cheekbone region, this indentation in the face, where there isn't any fat. The skin has tightened up around it, and so it deepens into this region here. And these are sections that you want to keep in mind with the skull. There's some other things, muscular things to keep in mind as well, such as, in particular, above the head, there's usually a kind of weird semi-triangle. It almost looks like a protractor or something like that up above here, and that's usually a muscular thing. And there can, be additional lines in this, depending on age and a few different things. And this sort of section up here, that's a muscular thing. It's not a bone thing, but it is something to keep in mind, that the muscles and the face and the skin can affect that region up there. But these are more or less the sections of the skull that you need to keep in mind. There's also it also is probably good to note that the sockets do, as I pointed out on this side, I'm kind of drawing here to draw your attention real quick. See that side there? The eye itself, it divots a bit. Notice that difference in shade between this line here, where you can see it's lighter here and darker here. That's because the sockets themselves, it sticks out a bit. those sockets right at that edge. It sticks out a bit before it goes into the actual skull here. And that's something to keep in mind as well, because depending on the angle at which you're drawing the face and depending on how tight the skin is, it could have an effect where you are going to have something not necessarily much. You might draw some line there, just like a bit of a line just to indicate that that part of the bone in the face is there. Generally, you'd only do this sort of thing well-defined, something like this with older characters. Younger characters are a lot harder to draw because of their faces lacking distinctive hard shadows. Hard shadows being, strong lines. And so a child's face has to be defined using soft shadows only, which makes drawing children and babies and things like that much harder, whereas drawing, say, a very old man where he's got tons of wrinkles and well-defined features is much, much easier. Now, I have an example here of how translating, well, obviously, this character here, his name's Ragnarok, by the way. This character here, who I drew up as a good example, he has a very tight bit of skin. You can see sort of what I was talking about here, where notice how the jawline feeds into this line next to his teeth, and then that kind of creates that divot, that kind of hole where in the jaw where there's no teeth, that kind of section there, as you can see. And then notice these lines underneath the eye. You have the visible part of the eye, but then you also have these lines beneath the eye, and that is indicating the sockets where it's kind of dug in a little bit. Now, the temples are not really defined so much on here, but that's just, this character in particular. I sometimes define the sort of temples on Ragnarok, sometimes I don't. But this is a good example of how you take the sort of information that you would gather from the skull, and then it kind of translates into a face. I just wanted to show these side by side so you can get an idea of how much the skull can affect the shape of the face. Ragnarok being kind of an extreme example because his face is so tight-skinned. A character who has less tight skin or maybe is a bit fatter, their face is going to have much softer features, but even still, while those features are going to be a lot softer in a character who's not as quite well-toned in their face as Ragnarok is, the skull is still going to have a very large effect in how the shape of that character's face is going to go. You just have to keep in mind the effects that, a fatter face is going to have, such as the lines here that well define this sort of indentation where there is no bone in the skull. They wouldn't be there. It would fatten up, as you'd see in most characters' faces. Now, with all that said, I'm going to now play on screen an example of me taking these principles that I talked about, where I go through the process of defining groups in the face. You'll notice me defining where I'm going to have the jawbone. I'm defining sections where the eye sockets are and the visible part of the eye is supposed to be. You'll notice me defining sections of cheekbone and areas like that. Defining parts of the jaw, the brow line. And then you'll also notice me going through and then detailing out from there. Something to keep in mind as far as when you go about drawing something like this. I compare it to molding clay. It's a good way of thinking about it, molding clay. Because that's more or less what I oftentimes think about myself when I'm drawing either a character's body or their faces. I think of molding clay. And the reason I think of molding clay is because molding clay is very three-dimensional. You want to think about your drawing in three-dimensional terms, even though you're drawing in two-dimensional, You're drawing two-dimensional, but you want to think in three-dimensional terms so that you bring that depth and that life to what it is that you're drawing. So I think of that. I think of the depth. You know, where are the indentations? How is the face going to mold together into what I want? And so I outline those sections where parts of the face are going to be higher than others. Parts of the face are going to be lower than others. And so that's very, very important to keep in mind. You want to know exactly where it is that these sections are and define them, and then mold the face out is the best way I can say it. Mold that face. And take a lot of time. Be very, very, very patient. You're going to have to probably draw and redraw and go over and erase a bunch all the time. Especially when you're practicing, you're going to have to go over and over and over and over again trying to get everything to look the way you want. There's probably going to be a lot of times where, oh, this eye is, it's off, and then you try to adjust it, and then it's still off, and then you adjust the other one, and again and over and doing this sort of thing. It happens. Just keep in mind that no matter how much you do it, you're never going to get the face perfect, because there is no such thing as a perfect face. You might have an idea of where things are going. You may have this idea of where things should be, but at the same time, art is very difficult. Now, a trick that you might use with your, if you were doing traditional art and you're trying to position the eyes, you could use something like a ruler and line them up very, very specific so they have an exact distance between one another, and it's easier to line them up that way. I am just kind of eyeballing it in the example I'm putting on screen, so as far as getting that exact and getting that right, I don't really get it quite right, because I'm just kind of eyeballing on screen what I'm trying to do, and that's okay. It's not the best, but it's fine. It happens. So I'm going to continue to let what the example that I have on screen play out, and I'm just going to let you watch through the rest of it, and I hope that you get some kind of understanding out of it. I believe I've explained about as much as I can as far as the process that I go through in drawing faces. If there is any questions that you have for me, you can leave them in the comments, or if you're in my Discord server, you can bring them to my Discord server, ask me questions there, and I'll be happy to answer them if there's anything that I forgot to touch on. Anyway, though, guys, I hope that it's been helpful. I'll see you all in the next one.